Good morning, everyone, and welcome again to the Kennebec Valley Chamber Business Insider Breakfast at the Senator Inn in Augusta, Maine. My name is Kim Vandermeulen, and I'm the chairman of the board and standing in for Ross Cunningham, who is going through his Leadership Maine training this week and couldn't be with us. I want to thank our sponsors, and these are the sponsors that sponsor the program for the entire year: Central Maine Power, and Kennebec Savings Bank. So thank you so much for sponsoring what is a great program. We're all looking forward to our speaker this morning. I had not met Mike before this morning, but Mike Mitchell, he hails from Calais, Maine, received his bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's of social work at New York University, and became the clinical director of crisis and counseling here in Augusta in 2003. Mike assumed the role of president and CEO in 2014. Mike has nearly 30 years of clinical management experience and in many organizations has been a trailblazer in behavioral health field. In addition, he's experienced as a clinician and an administrator and reviews training and treatment curriculums in areas of children's behavioral health, parent-family empowerment, behavior management, and behavioral health staff development. His most recent work is with Pathways and Horizon treatment programs for a 5-week intensive jail program at the Kennebec County Correctional Facility. Here to speak to us this morning about mental health and how it can be a key part to the success of each business. So Mike, we welcome you, and I'll let you take over.
Thank you. Whoops. Thank you, Kim, and thank you, the Chamber, for inviting me to speak today. I essentially want to address two issues this morning in our conversation, and then we'll have some time for questions afterwards. The first being the realities of mental health and substance abuse issues in our community and how it affects not only our families and the well-being and the general quality of our lives, but also the bottom line, and how it affects really business in a very real, tangible way. The other is what we can do about it. What are the options, and also how we as a community can embrace the idea that this is not somebody else's problem, that this is all of our problem. In the course of time, crisis and counseling can be somewhat of an example of it. This past year we're celebrating our 45th anniversary of doing business, and we started out as a storefront substance abuse drop-in center in Hollowell. I haven't seen pictures of that, but I have this image of this kind of hippie-ish kind of thing in which people kind of stumbled in varying degrees of intoxication to find some way to turn around what was not working. And we still sing along with that song even today. We have one of the largest substance abuse treatment programs in the state. Everything from screening and consultation to what is called an IOP, which is an intensive outpatient program in which 9 hours a week somebody comes for 5 weeks to intensively turn around what can be an incredibly powerful and destructive force. We now see on a national level, and we've been experiencing it on a state level for some time, an opioid addiction problem that is devastating. Now, this has happened before. Actually, back in the 70s, heroin also had a significant bite in our communities. Then it shifted to cocaine, to crack, and in doing so, the nature of the addiction shifted. And what we have now is probably one of the most powerful addictive processes that we know about, and that is the opiates and how it affects the brain, how it affects the behavior, thinking process, and also what you will do in order to keep not only the buzz going, but also to keep away from the withdrawals. And so you have this incredibly powerful addictive process that will have you do almost anything. And it can start as innocently as having painkillers for tooth removal and having a predisposition to being vulnerable to that addictive process. And within weeks, it can be heading down a pathway that can be destructive to families, to not only the people around you, but also the community that we live in. We also have the reality of mental illness or mental health concerns, because when we say the word mental illness, we oftentimes think of people who have serious mental illness. illness. We're talking schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, major psychological conditions that can be quite disabling. But that's not the vast majority of people who deal with mental health issues. That is actually a relatively small population. The larger one is all of us. What we know is that really about half the functional working population of the country have a diagnosable behavioral health condition. Half, okay? Now, that's a pretty wide range, and also when we say diagnosable, it just means that you can be described in some way. And that can be a temporary situation that you're dealing with a separation, divorce, or you're dealing with a loss, or it can be that you're dealing with an ongoing level of what typically is the larger group of people, which is depression and anxiety. And depression and anxiety can have a devastating effect on a person's life on a low simmer. So that you're not talking about somebody who can't function at all, but it may be hard to get up out of bed. You get up out of bed, but you are going into the day thinking, when's this day going to end? Anxiety, on the other hand, is living in what-if land. Essentially saying, how can I get through this day? Because what if this happens? And what if this happens? And what if this happens? And that level of foreboding and that level of avoidance of what you feel is going to be the next bad thing can be all-consuming. That's what the vast majority of people who are dealing with behavioral health issues are dealing with. And I say all of us because I'm certain that there's a large amount of people in this room who at various stages of their lives, or even at this very moment, are dealing with some degree of that. So it's not them, it's all of us. And it's a part of our condition. Anthropological research has showed there's actually some benefits to it. It has been part of our evolutionary process. Bipolar disorder works because sometimes people who are manic are really good leaders. Sometimes they can be really innovative. Sometimes they also can be incredibly destructive. And so it stays in our genetic pool because it does serve some function. A little bit of anxiety works. A lot of anxiety doesn't. A little bit of depression is a natural reaction to loss and the sense of despair that might happen in any case. It's a lot of it. It's when you don't have the resources to resolve through it is when it's a major issue. So if you think about that, it's something that we all can have some level of familiarity with. The cost of that is amazing, though. That if you think about it from an employer perspective, of lost productivity, of days lost of work, called out sick, came in late, whatever it might be, broken material, machines because of inattention or whatever it might be, those real costs, tangible costs, are upwards of $300 billion every year. I'll say that number one more time. $300 billion. That's what it costs. Now, what we also know is that the research is growing to show if you do good preventative and early intervention with these issues, you have a 3-to-1 return on your investment. 3-to-1. You can reduce down the cost of lost productivity by 3-to-1 if you invest in treatment, if you invest in prevention, if you invest in the things that actually treat it as the reality that it is. And so that's where it comes back to us as a community. They say, well, why aren't we doing that? Isn't that obvious? $300 billion is a lot of money. The reason is we don't talk about it. We just accept it. We accept that that's a part of doing business. Yeah, I know Joe drinks a little bit too much. Or, yeah, I think that person might be a little high. Or, I don't know what's going on. She's not talking anymore. She's kind of staying in her office. We just kind of go through and just accept it. Because having that conversation is hard. Yeah, there's some labor, thin lines that you have to walk too, right? You have to be careful about how that conversation goes. But not having the conversation can be incredibly destructive as well, because the silence can give a sense of tacit approval. The silence basically also can say it doesn't exist. Well, I feel really miserable. I assume I look really miserable, but nobody's acting like there's anything wrong. So that must either be okay or it must just be me. That isolation can perpetuate the next day, the next month, and the next year of it. And an accumulation of the cost. So it is part of what we can see, and I'm assuming that as I'm talking, you might have thought of situations in which a coworker, a colleague, somebody that is subordinate staff, you have somebody that you're supervising or making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do, and you have some inclination that there's a behavioral health concern. How do you approach it? What do you do with it? Well, first of all, I would encourage all of us to have a general sense of what, at any given time, the impact of substance abuse and mental health issues are on our business. We should generally have a sense of that. How much are we paying in health insurance? How much are we paying in lost time? What is our lost time ratio? And how can we assume that a good portion of that is related to behavioral health concerns? And what are we doing in the work environment to promote a behavioral health environment that says, this is a place in which we encourage you to take care of yourself. This is a place in which we support you doing what you need to do to make life better, to make this moment better, and for you to be a better employee. What are we doing to invest in solid health insurance coverage to make sure that behavioral health is adequately covered? One of the hardest things that I've had to deal with as a clinician is to get somebody to the watering hole, and because of a lack of good coverage, they can't adequately follow through. And so if you get somebody with an opiate addiction and you give them 3 sessions, you might as well not bother, because the power of some of these issues take way more investment than that. And we know that. It's not news. We know the power of it. We know what's necessary to turn around significant behavioral health issues. We don't invest in it. And so, on a micro level, are we as businesses investing in it? And are we creating an environment that says, this is not a criminal issue, because we're not law enforcement. And this doesn't have to be a disciplinary issue if we can work together. Because it's expensive to get an employee up to a place in which they are a productive part of the workforce. And to have that loss is a real tangible loss as far as the bottom line is concerned. And so are we translating that into how can we prevent that from happening? If we had a machine that was doing this, we'd get rid of it. Or at least we'd try to repair it. And so talking about it, putting it on the table, making it real, using the understanding that we have as part of the conversation that says, I care about you, and I care about how you can contribute to this business, and what can I do to help you with that? Now, as an employer, we've had those conversations. It's still not as good as I would like it to be. We still are not as embracing and inclusive in that conversation as it needs to be, because the amount of shame on the other end is powerful. To talk about depression, to talk about anxiety, to talk about an addiction. Because as we know, 50% of the workforce is dealing with these issues. We also know that the vast majority of them are talking about it, and most are not treated for it. And so, as we're looking at where our tax dollars are going, and how we're getting a good return on our dollar, that we have to be way more looking into the future and saying, okay, are we adequately treating behavioral health as an essential part of the health of our community? If you were a young couple coming into a community, there's a couple things you might look at. What's the housing like? What's the schools like? What's the recreational? How safe is it? What's the commerce areas look like? Rarely do people say, well, what's the behavioral health system look like? Right? That's not usually on the checklist. But I can assure you, if suddenly something horrible happens in your life and you need to pick up the phone to find out where the crisis service is, you want to make sure that crisis service is doing their job. We're in the crisis business. And one of the things about that business is that you don't hear about us if everything's going well. Okay, you only hear things when something really bad happens. The same thing is true of behavioral health services in general. We're kind of off to the side. A lot of misunderstanding about how the business works. We are a nonprofit private business. Our services are reimbursed predominantly through insurance companies, not through government grants or allocations. And we have the bottom line to meet like everybody else. Crisis and Counseling operates with about an $8 million budget, 130 employees. That's not a small business. And consequently, we have not, as nonprofits, I don't think, embraced the business community. I don't think that we have seen ourselves as part of the community, but kind of like we treat ourselves at times like we are a public service. We aren't a public service. We're a business. And the budget cuts and the rate reductions that have happened for behavioral health in the last 10 years have really forced us to be much leaner and embrace business practices. We're talking to outpatient clinicians about budgetary issues that we would never have talked about 15 years ago, because we've had to become really much more efficient businesses. And we need to work together with the chamber, with other organizations that says that we're good neighbors, you know who we are. And if we're in a situation in which budgets are being cut, that you know that we're giving a valuable contribution to the community and that you're beside us. Because oftentimes we're standing alone. And if that service is not there, you, your children, and your parents, and your neighbors are going to be affected by it. Bernie Sanders, for those, regardless of your politics, I love this metaphor that he used. He says, how can we complain about the mental health system that we have taken one bolt at a time and expecting it to continue to stay together? How can we complain? That's what we've been doing. If you have your car, you take a screw off here, you take a bolt off there, there's a point in which the wheels are going to come off. We are at that point. And so there's no more fat on the bone. We are cutting muscle. We're cutting way into the fabric of the health of the community. And what we need to do is to say, we need these essential things that need to be adequately provided because it is about the health of our community. And we want to embrace that partnership with businesses, not as some sort of tax drag onto the system, but really an enhancement, that we are working together to make sure our communities are all that they can be. And so I look forward to continuing to partner, and I hope to see many of your faces going forward, that we can do that together. Thank you.